Hey everyone, Matt from StrongView Personal Training here. So this week I want to go through the next iteration of our Tech Corner series. So we've already covered your squat, bench, deadlift, and some of the more common variations in them. Today we're going to get into a little bit more accessory-based movement and just some less common considerations you'll see when looking at single leg squat training. So single leg squat training, things like split squats, lunges, right? These kinds of guys, Bulgarian split squats, really common stuff. Even single leg presses to a point, I think, probably fall into that category. But what are they good for? Great for building extra leg volume in higher volume hypertrophy sessions. So maybe you're doing a lot of squatting, you're focusing more on building your training volumes. And at a certain point, your upper back and your lats might become toast in your squat session, but your legs can still take a little bit more, and you need more volume in order to get more muscle growth, let's say. These single leg versions tend to be a little bit easier on your back and your core and your bracing in general. Tend to be a little bit more direct to the legs just because there's less weight involved. You got half the number of legs working, right? So really useful in that context. But on top of that, I find them really, really useful as a corrective tool. So if we have lifters who have a hip shift or a rotation or some kind of an asymmetry in their squat, it could even be laterally, right? Where both sides, they lose their footing, for example, and they go too far out, right? Well, in a bilateral stance, that's less of a problem where the lifter might blow by it a little bit more. But in a unilateral stance on one leg, that becomes a big problem because it's very hard to balance out here. So teaches the lifter to kind of center over their foot a little bit more. So three main considerations we want to take a look at when we're looking at single leg squat training drills. First and foremost, you want to just try to make sure if you are using it for hypertrophy-based stuff, trying to keep it specific to powerlifting. Want to match the joint angles up pretty closely, or as close as is reasonable, with your squat training. So if your barbell back squat, bottom position ends up looking something like this, right? We probably want to get, at least at the hips and knees, something similar, right? So for example, let's say you're using a front foot elevated split squat and go goblet style, right? I'd want that same sort of idea where I'm, about there. And that's pretty close for me to the bottom of my squat. So making sure you're kind of loading in that same pattern is going to be really, really important at getting good carryover. Second thing to take a look at, and this falls a little bit more onto that corrective side of the spectrum, is going back to our lifter who has, let's say, a little bit of a hip rotation where they squat like this, and they're a little crooked, their knees turn in, their hips are a bit rotated to the right. They're a bit more closed off in that left hip or that right hip, a little more open in that left hip, and they're not able to really get into the left side, right? You see it both ways, but we'll use this as our example. Really commonly with those split squats, we'll see people unable to move their hips properly on top of their legs. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if you're standing on your left leg, right, you're probably going to be out here a little more rotated to the right. Similarly, if you're standing on your right leg, you're probably going to see a split squat that looks something like that, where the hip kicks out a little outside of the knee. They lose expansion in this oblique, and they're not creating good abdominal pressure on that right side. And then the knee falls in, and maybe they have a bum knee, maybe they don't. But regardless, you're seeing that movement shift a little bit, and there's some rotation where there probably shouldn't be. So learning how to move the hips on top of the legs and creating that frontal and transverse plane, so side to side, and rotational control at the hips is really beneficial for just keeping long-term hip health. Maybe it doesn't make a huge difference to you in your squat and your powerlifting total, maybe it does. But for general day-to-day function, like walking, getting out of the car, stuff like that, that's a little bit different than just a squat where there might be more rotation and shifting involved. Pretty useful. Also just in terms of general injury prevention, keeping good muscle development across the board with a broad range of hip function, pretty useful that way. So maintaining that control, even if it is just maintenance, it's really, really useful because powerlifting is up, down, forward, back, not a lot of side-to-side movement. So making sure in that split squat, that lifter who maybe kicks out here can control to getting a bit more square, right? And then the last thing we want to look at when we are taking a look at hip movement and how they stack on top of their femur is maybe overcorrecting a little bit. So going back to our example of our lifter who shifts a little to the right in their squat, maybe in their split squats, instead of having them try to square up where they're 90 degrees between the femur and the hip, right? maybe for them, because we know they're kind of a little too open on the left side, maybe we have them actually over square to where their split squat is like so, and we're closing that angle between the hip and the femur. So this is less than 90 degrees if we look at it from the top, and going through split squats like that, right? You can load these pretty hard and really cook. And you can see here, same sort of idea. Same kind of torso angle. I'm just kind of messing with my side to side and rotational torso movement. And rolling through like that. And so theoretically, as a corrective exercise, that should help you train a squat pattern and get you a little deeper into that left hip. So if I was here where I was out of that left hip, now theoretically I should be able to get into the left hip a little bit more and maybe squat a little bit more symmetrically, right? So big take-homes for this. Using single leg training as extra leg volume in higher rep leg sessions for squats. Making sure you've got good control and you're not shifting too much side to side, and you're keeping relatively symmetrical left to right, meaning stacked over the foot, relatively square hips. And then finally, if you do have a big shift left to right where one side looks drastically different than the other, overcorrect a little, right? Don't just go to square, but go a bit past square to overcorrect that imbalance, and that should help speed things along with improving your technique in the long run. That's all for now. Thank you very much for your watch. Leave any comments or questions you've got below, or send them to me as a direct message on Instagram. Lastly, we've got a great group going on right now on Facebook. It's called Starting Powerlifting. It's a community of people who are really interested in strength training, as well as people who are currently powerlifters or looking to get into it. You can post that form review there. There's some great information. There's links to good articles on developing your powerlifting technique, building training programs. All that's in there, along with a community of like-minded people. If you're interested in that, I'll leave a link in the description below, as well as in my Instagram bio. Thanks. See you all next week.